All right. So I guess the first thing, welcome. The biggest thing I saw this week was DuckDB's went to 1.2. And that gave us a lot of fun trying to get the Substrate extension updated because suddenly Substrate wasn't working. Because it wasn't built with 1.2. We updated to the latest version of DuckDB and discovered that all the tests were failing because they started removing stuff because it's now a community extension. So like they no longer have Substrate methods directly on the connection. So we have so we dealt with those issues. They've also removed apparently Substrate from the ADBC implementation that they had. So I mean that makes some sense. If it's a community extension, then the community extension should be providing that support. So we did get the release. It took a couple days, but people can now use Substrate as long as they install it from the community, which means people may need to change how they call it. What other fun things? Documentation has not really been. So when I created the 1.2 release in the community extension, I said, hey, here's a link to the documentation on their website, which they have removed. So so there's some cleanup there that needs to be done. We need to go and like repurpose their documentation and pull it into ours, into the extension and into the command line or whatever. Not a big deal, but fun.
Well, thanks for hearing that out.
Yeah, it took a number of us to get it to work. But yeah. And I'm glad to actually see people were filing issues. I can't get this to work. Or I can't get it to work. There was somebody who said, I need this feature, and it's not in the old version, but it turns out it's in the new version. So it was just a matter of getting the release out. So people knew where to go. It's good.
It's good to know that people are using our stuff. I keep waiting for someone to yell at me about Substrate Java breaking something, and I'm like, okay, is someone using this?
Yeah, we just did a breaking-ish change to Substrate Go that we didn't bump the version for. So slight syntax change. But yeah, we'll see if people complain. They may or not. Apparently DuckDB, the Go wrapper for DuckDB has issues, specifically I think around arrow or something like that. So the DuckDB Go implementation probably is getting a version bump just to deal with the new version of DuckDB. So yay. That's all I really have. I mean, we discussed a little bit that there are some outstanding tickets or PRs that we need to do that we generally should take a look at.
I was just looking at the pending reviews, and there's a couple that probably weren't close looks, but also the precision timestamp one. That one just feels like, yeah, we should do that, and it just needs a second approval, so I can do that after this and get that merged in. But adding picoseconds to timestamps, that seems yeah.
And it doesn't really hurt.
No,
even if nobody uses it, it doesn't hurt that much. Yeah.
Just put an action item on me to look at it and merge it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the dynamic parameter expansion one, I haven't looked at that in a while. Rollup cube, I haven't looked at that either.
Yeah, rollup cube is interesting. I mean, it's another way of doing it, and I guess the concern is that if you have a huge number of expressions, that even with the recent addition of um, um, pointers to expressions, so you don't actually have to pull out the entire expression every time, that it still could be an excessive amount of data. That having a mechanism just to say, here are the 8 expressions I want to do a roll up of or a cube of is handy.
Mm.
Substrate Go, we actually added a method to do roll-ups and cubes. So there's sort of a builder that helps you build your expressions based on the new functionality. So replacing it with roll-up and cube would just happen, and the person it wouldn't even really change the API, which is nice.
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. It's okay to have 2 ways to say the same thing. One of them is a lot more compact.
Yeah.
Also, sometimes the compact way is quite useful because it's easy to tell, oh, this is an explicit rollup versus, oh, you've expanded the set into like the 4 or 5 different permutations of this, and it's hard to go back. And that extra knowledge can be quite useful.
Yeah, it's like your underlying consumer has a rollup operator.
Yeah, you can just use rollup directly versus like, is this a rollup? I can't tell. And it's like more work to try to figure that out.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, that sounds reasonable.
Yeah, then there's just the dynamic parameter one, which we know we talked about a little bit last time. But need to go back to it.
Just kind of glance through it. It seems pretty straightforward, I guess.
And we're adding them as...
I think the one thing that we went back and forth on is like I suggested one thing and Jack suggested another thing, which was the whether or because we talked about whether or not to use names or numbers, right? Or and then implicit ordering, and then I think the way that we end up, I think right now there's like, instead of names, we're going to use numbers that you can then assign the numbers to the things, which is like having names, except that you don't get the readability of the names instead of the implicit ordering. I think that was the only thing that I think that's part of the discussion that's left.
Dynamic parameter binding, and it's like, oh yeah, so it's an anchor to the binding, and then okay, then I like okay.
One thing it mentions in the description is that it can enable other use cases with sharing execution plans without embedding sensitive information. Does that mean that the binding does not need to be present in the plan?
Well, I think you need to know what you don't need to have, depending on how you want to do it, right? Like if you wanted to have it separately and you wanted to provide a plan with the binding separately, which we haven't defined a method for that, you could do that, but you don't have to put them in the plan permanently just because you're leaving them as parameters until the last minute.
Right. I was just going to say, so as a consumer, I should expect that, I mean, let's say that we wanted to do some kind of side channel thing where we send the dynamic parameters on some other channel so that it's more sensitive. I don't know. Then the plan would not have the bindings, but it would still have the references.
Right.
And then I would sort of reattach them. Would the plan be valid in the meantime?
It would basically be a partial plan, right? It's a plan that you can't finalize. I mean, you can put 0 values in and see what happens if you wanted to try it that way, but yeah.
There's also like a use case for this that isn't even sensitive information. It's just like, hey, let me give you a plan with a bunch of placeholders, give me back some UUID to it, and then other systems can be like, I want to run this query, here's the UUID, and here's the parameters for it. It's basically on the Postgres, or not even just Postgres, it's the prepared queries kind of dealio. I think one of these cases is like caching for like, I want to be able to cache the query plan, but ignore these dynamic parameters which might change. And there's also just like handles to plans, which is kind of why I was partial to like naming the parameters, because it makes that use case easier to do. It's like, here's a handle versus a bunch of like anchor parameters that need to map to things. But I think it's like one level of indirection is fine.
The anchors are equivalent to names, though. I mean, they're just numbers instead of strings.
Yeah, but then I have to send a request of a bunch of numbers with no associated names on them.
Right, but it's sort of my point, right? The way that we've got it currently sort of specified, you've got this map of numbers to. You have to create a map of numbers to things. If you're going to have numbers, you might as well have names. I mean,
You're just gonna say no. What I was saying is that right now we're mapping like numbers to things, and I'm like just use names to begin with, and if you want numbers, you just make them 1,
right.
2, 3, 4, 5.
And then we were saying that the reason we didn't want to use names is because everywhere else we don't use names, and we just would use numbers. And then, but there's a difference between explicitly calling out here's the anchor number and saying that this is index number 5 in the list of parameters because the references are there, and then using that.
The other reason I think that kind of breaks down a little bit is I feel like everywhere else that we use anchors for, like extensions and types, those anchors are relative to a single plan. So like you encode the plan and you encode those anchors relative to that plan. The kind of use cases I might think for dynamic parameter binding, I might make a plan once, and then I might reference those parameters from multiple different contexts where like I need them to be stable across like a single plan. I want those things to be stable no matter like where I use them from.
Okay, so that's a good use case for having numbers or names.
Yeah,
for stability.
Like we can
make because you can have I'm going to use here are my sensitive numbers from 1,000 to 10,000 or something. You just have them reserved, and then use
with the way it is now, you can still do it. It's just that when we make the plan, I'm going to be like, cool, like this dynamic parameter 1 maps to this name, and whenever I store the plan, I have to store a mapping from like the number to the name, and then do like a live indirection, which I think is fine.
Okay, I'm good with that now.
Well, we'll see how much people like it. Maybe we'll fix it for 2.0 whenever we get to.
Yeah, I think the main thing I need is just the ability to specify a value without having to worry about escaping the value.
Escaping the value.
It's maybe not a substrate problem. It's maybe more of an SQL parsing problem.
Yeah.
Because substrate. Wow. Substrate's great as long as you can specify it. So you can't actually specify invalid values in Substrate. It's been a problem for testing.
Speaking of SQL, I've started trying to rip out the SQL stuff out of Isthmus to isolate, and it's going okay.
Cool.
But yeah. There's like too many ways to configure a parser for us to have opinions on it, and I think I'm leaning towards we have a utility parser that's very much like we use this to parse TPCH for our tests. If you can use it if you want, but honestly, like just configure your own, and here's how. Using calcite stuff, like the parsing stuff is all calcite. It's has very little to do with actual like Isthmus translation. It should just be like use the calcite machinery and give us a calcite plan. We'll go from there. Yeah, I think that's it unless no one has any more.
Yeah, I think so.
Topics.
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I'm giving a talk. Actually, I'm giving a talk next week at the Calcite meetup on Substrate and planning using Substrate with Calcite. Be online at the. Maybe I'll post it somewhere. Should probably finish that talk too, but
definitely post it. Probably post it in Slack, maybe on the mailing list.
Yeah, I'll put a link
and
in
the agenda.
Post the mailing list, and then I'll get more motivation to finish that before Thursday.
All right. Good luck.
Cool.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
So.
See ya.